So, welcome to the Business Change and Transformation Conference Europe. This session is a panel discussion hosted by myself, Arend Slater. I'm Head of Marketing of Solverboard. Solverboard is an all-in-one platform for managing innovation, business change and transformation at enterprise level. And last year, we engaged with a number of innovation leaders across a number of different industries to understand their challenges, what it was that was getting in the way of innovation and making it harder for them to do their job, and identified a number of blockers. Rather than just presenting those blockers out to the world as a blog post, we decided to put together a report, publish a report where we explain those blockers, put those forward, tell those stories, but turn to some experts in the industry to offer their remedies, their possible solutions to tackling those blockers. And three of those experts are joining me today. Firstly, I wanted to talk about the relationship between innovation, change and transformation. And to kick us off, I'm going to turn to Katherine.
Thank you so much. I'll just give you a little introduction as well from myself. So as Arend said, I'm Katherine and I work for KSK Consulting. My background is very much a mixture of corporate and agency, moving between those sort of genres. I've had a corporate finance background, I've had a little bit of a transformation director background, and I have a psychology hat on as well. So I suppose I'm always looking at that relationship between profit, performance and process, if you like. So my view on that question is, what's the relationship? I guess I see it as the three titles there, innovation being that trialing phase. We've got to look at innovation as a new evolution, iteration. You know, we're constantly trialing things with a view that it's, and we'll come on to this, that it's okay to fail. And then transformation for me is that kind of stage where we've gone, okay, I know that I want to, either I've been forced to or I've been invited to the conversation, but I know that I want to move from here to here. How I get there, whether I need to go this route or that route, but I've kind of got a little bit of a clearer place. I want to move, particularly from one place to another. And then I guess for me, change management is those tools. It's a real art, change management, and we'll all have been party to the fact that not everyone can do it, and it's because it's an art. Collaboration, communication, coordination, and particularly movement. I think we've got to be talking all the time and using all of those sort of coordination tools to get there. So it is three distinct fields, but all completely intrinsically linked.
Fantastic. Arend, if you could do the same.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Arend Welmers. I'm the CEO of 90 Days Limited, and we're probably the UK's and possibly Europe's leading expert on what we call ownership thinking. So that's the idea of how do you get everybody coming to work every day, thinking, feeling, and acting as if they own your business. I'm also a consultant, work with companies all over the world. And I'm also an entrepreneur and investor in some of the businesses I work with. We're interested in driving performance of those businesses and also simultaneously improving the working lives of the people in that business, and hence the connection to ownership thinking. The interesting question for me around those kind of words, innovation, transformation, and change management, is I think they're probably used interchangeably often. And so, when Arend asked the question about, we need to kind of start the conversation with thinking about the difference between these ideas. I did a little bit of homework, and essentially the definition of innovation is this idea that it's a new idea or a new method. But when I thought about it, I think that's too broad, and I think it's really, for me, much more about this idea of creating value. So new value, something that customers will pay your organization for. So I prefer to think about innovation as the sort of new ideas or new methods, but particularly linked to new value. In terms of things like transformation, I think really transformation is really more about scale of change, if you like. So it's really more about taking the organization to a new level, a new direction, a new level of performance, and a new direction. And with regards to change management, what I really think about that is that change management fundamentally is minimizing resistance to change. I think it's the act of, bringing everybody into the conversation, making sure that all the stakeholders or understand what's happening, what the change is that's required, and that they are broadly supporting it. So I think change management really is more about the act of minimizing that resistance to change.
Fantastic. And Cris, your background and your take on those areas.
Thanks, Aaron. So as you can see, my name's Cris Beswick. My background really quickly, I spent about 15 years as an entrepreneur in the design industry. So from sort of early to mid 90s through to 2008, I spent that time as an industrial designer. And the latter part of that, I built a group of companies in that space. And obviously the background and the core ingredients to all that and the core components to the design industry specifically are what really resonates with corporates today. So about 2008, I was fortunate enough to exit and sold my companies, moved into the innovation space, and specifically the advisory space around innovation. And as Aaron said earlier, I'm now the co-founder of a boutique advisory firm on strategy, leadership and culture, specifically around innovation, called Outcome. My thoughts on change, transformation and innovation are the challenges. The words are often conflated and they are sometimes confused as one in the same. Especially currently where we have digital transformation thrown into the mix. And I think Aaron's point is really relevant. It's about scale. What I see from the clients we work with around the world is many of them have changed periodically, but very few of them have fundamentally transformed. And by transformation, I mean a real whole-scale shift because of external conditions, market forces, competitors, trends, or just the world changing fundamentally. And there are very few organizations that have continuously and successfully completely transformed themselves. So I think it's really important to differentiate generic change and change management and change programs from transformation. And that's probably one of the things that most organizations struggle with at the moment, is conflating those things or considering them the same thing, just different words, because fundamentally they're different.
Thanks, that sets the scene beautifully. So as I say, we looked at 5 blockers to innovation, which we've sort of touched on briefly. The first one, fear of failure, crops up all the time. It's very easy to say that we should embrace failure, but how can innovation teams help their organizations to embrace uncertainty and see failure in a more positive light? And that was the question we put to our experts in the report. And I'll start with Arend to respond to that.
Thanks, Aaron. So from my perspective, leaders and employees need to understand that disagreement is not the same as conflict. And I see this as a major issue in organizations. You know, people in organizations learn very quickly that they're only being asked to bring their hands to work and not their hearts and their minds. And the reason for that is because if disagreement is seen as conflict, then you know, they learn very, very quickly not to disagree. And so I think what you then get from an organizational perspective, from the leadership perspective of that organization, you get exactly what you deserve, which is compliance, but not a lot of added value. You get no ownership, certainly. And you know, the perpetual problem, which is a lack of accountability. So I go into organizations a lot, and one of the most common complaints is this thing, you know, we need our people to hold themselves more accountable. And whenever I encounter that question, I understand immediately that this is a failure of leadership, because that's really not an issue in an organization that is properly led. So I think, you know, when you've got that problem in an organization, you've created a culture where you have that fear of failure. And like I said earlier, you get pretty much exactly what you deserve.
Excellent. Cris, you talked about two core issues when it comes to fear of failure, either fear of innovation activity, failing due to past experiences, or lack of understanding of how to adopt an innovation-led strategy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this really builds on Arend's point, and it is a leadership issue, and the drive for this rests with leadership, but leaders can only lead in the right way if it's supported by a proper, well-developed innovation strategy. And the challenge is, if you look at trying to drive innovation, and risk and failure and how we deal with those things are components of how we drive innovation. If you look chronologically, we go back to the transformation question. If you look chronologically at why most approaches or efforts or programs, transformation programs around innovation fail, they typically fail because an organization can't scale capability. So they can't make it cultural, and risk and fear of failure will be core components of why they can't embed that in culture. If you then reverse engineer that, so chronologically go back in reverse, they typically haven't scaled capability and embedded the innovation capability because there's been no change in management or leadership. So to Arend's point, the leadership teams and the management teams aren't in the right mindset, have the right behavior, etc., and aren't leading and owning the innovation agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. Katherine, you talked about defining what actually success and failure really means.
So I liked a lot what Cris was saying about designing this. So let's look at it rather than fear of failure to attention to outcomes. More broadly, there are so many different models that you can use and different processes for change and innovation. But if you look at it as a fear or a champion type culture, so you've kind of got that emotional and cognitive culture. So I work very much with the psychology of how we're going to do change. And quite often businesses will lead with that cognitive culture. So that's all about consequence, if you like. So if you don't do this, I will close down your department, or if you don't hit this KPI, you will not move forward for, the next level of what you want in your career. It's all about sort of passive aggressive punishment. And it's good to have goals and it's good to have markers, but it's too consequence orientated. The best and most successful change initiatives and innovation initiatives are driven with that championship culture. They're driven with emotional culture underneath, which is all about identity. Who am I? And as Arend said earlier, the hearts and minds. Fear is the word that we've got in this sentence, fear of failure. Well, I don't know any situation I've ever been in where I've performed at my best when I'm fearful. Absolutely at no point ever will I be giving the right thing to the program. So I think we need to move away from fear of failure, not looking at, will I do this if I don't get a return on my investment? No, innovation is about iteration and trying things on the journey. What have we learned? What are the attentions to the outcomes? And as Cris said, designing that model, which has got real strategic practice behind it and not just sort of blundering through and hoping we get there, which will, of course, then lead people to that higher increased feeling of fear.
Absolutely. That leads nicely onto our second blocker, which is about conflicting goals in the organisation. And first, I'll go back to Cris.
The challenge again stems back to strategy. What does the organisation want from its pursuit of innovation, from all the time and effort and resources that it devotes, to the word innovation? What outcomes does it want? We specifically branded our advisory firm Outcome because fundamentally that's what it is, right? Innovation. The other challenge is, I think, innovation is too often seen as a thing that you do or that you have or that you get more of or that you buy more of. And the reality is innovation is an outcome, right? It's nothing more than an outcome, right? You haven't innovated and you are not innovative until the thing that you do, right? When it's out there in the market, when it's given to customers or whatever, when the feedback you get, when people say this is innovative, and the challenge is we've overused the word and we've bastardized the word, really. We've devalued the word because right from day one, we are on an innovation project. Well, no, you're on a project to solve a problem. It's only innovative at the end if you do something really, really clever and significant. So innovation is the outcome. The best measure of that is, and here's the phrase that I use all the time with senior teams, the innovation badge can only be bestowed upon you by your customers or your competitors, right? At the end, when we do something so demonstrably brilliant that our customers say, wow, that is really innovative, that's amazing, then something's innovative, right? The challenge is, as organizations, we self-profess our innovativeness too much, right? So then it becomes very, very easy to measure and create a set of KPIs where we're innovating all the time. Everything we do is innovative, right? And it's become too easy for organizations to create very simple metrics, which basically mean they meet all those metrics and KPIs, and they are then, in their mind, very innovative.
Katherine, you suggested in your response that the conflict comes between kind of business as usual and innovation goals, and that they shouldn't be separate, they should be connected and they should be interwoven. Is that right? Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, you know what, I've always found that businesses see business as usual and innovation as two distinct camps. Almost as if business as usual doesn't involve any innovation and innovation doesn't involve any business as usual. And in fact, that's obviously incorrect. Business as usual is by no means the perfect way of doing it, because we know that the reason that innovation exists is because we want to constantly iteratively improve things, go in a new direction, change something, make it better. And I think the key thing there with business as usual is we haven't got it right. We are always doing things in a certain way. We just feel a little bit more comfortable in that space, because that's what the wider group of us, that's what the majority of the business is doing and how they're operating. So we feel safe. Innovation feels like, well, we don't know the parameters yet. We're kind of trying things. We're playing in this space. We're unclear. We haven't defined anything. So it feels a little bit more risky. So the idea that they're two different things allows us the flexibility to say, well, I'm okay when I'm over here and I'm just trialing this for a little while. So it doesn't matter if it doesn't work. So there's no sort of concrete emotion attached to it other than that sort of that nervous risk. We shouldn't see these things as two distinct camps. We should see them as an interwoven set of parameters that we use to drive business forward. It is great to have things that are set in stone. Those things were only ever set in stone, most likely because we went through a phase of innovation before we got there. So it is, in fact, everything is interwoven and interlinked. And I think if we see innovation as such, it will become a much more concrete part of how we run a business, that constant idea that evolution is growth, even if what we learn, we don't implement.
Absolutely, absolutely. Arend, you looked at it, you said this was a big issue for you, the conflicting goals and rising mainly from silos in an organization, and looked at it from a sort of systems change approach. Explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, so Cris was talking a lot about the fact that actually, we've got generally we express our innovation ambitions or aspirations in terms of a few narrow goals, and the reality, and he's quite right, is that actually innovation, as Katherine was pointing out, can happen pretty much every part of the business, and there are lots of different objectives that are held in these different parts of the business. But there's another issue. Many years ago, I spotted what I've since termed functional thinking in businesses, and it's pretty much a serious disease, in my view. And you see it a lot when you actually, if you go into a business and you ask the people there what they do, and they start to tell you, to sort of describe what it is that they do in terms of their job description or indeed their job title. And so, if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that, for example, marketing departments think that their job is to develop sexy marketing campaigns that probably at the end of the day don't really add any value. Or, you know, HR departments think their job is to devise another appraisal system that nobody's going to use. Or finance departments think their job is to, you know, make it more difficult for people to claim their expenses, et cetera, et cetera. So what you get is actually people thinking very much from a functional perspective about their role. And what they all forget is actually their job is to work together to help this company grow faster and make more money. So actually underpinning that is really the way we've learned to work in organizations. So most organizations, of course not all organizations, but most organizations are structured hierarchically and arranged in these functional silos that you referred to a little bit earlier. And the problem of this is that I see pretty much every day is that what that promotes is what I call, what I see as narrow self-interest, and actually worse than that, internal competition for scarce resources. So, you kind of see people sandbagging their sort of their budgets, for example, protecting their turfs. And the problem behind that is actually it's the way that the management system of the organization is structured. So what I try and do is I try and change that behavior by bringing leadership teams together and actually getting them to work together rather than actually just meeting together.
Absolutely. So our third blocker is about lack of innovation skills. Katherine.
Look, I mean, I think largely there's two kind of schools of thought from my point of view on this. The first is that we need to know what we're measuring. I think a lot of lack of innovation skills is that we're lack of measurement. How do we know when we've been successful? So a lot of the work that I do with teams, from the leadership team all the way through the business, anyone who's involved at any level, at any area of the business who is going to be touched by this project or program or portfolio needs to have a voice. Now, their voice can be different. It can be at different stages. It can be in different areas of focus, but they need to be involved in some way, even if they're just a passive viewer of the information, or if they're completely active and driving that change. So I think when we see lack of innovation skills, quite often it's a lack of defined parameters. What does success look like? Not just what does it look like, how will I know when I've been successful? What should I expect to feel? What should I expect to not feel? What will happen along this journey that's likely going to influence that? And I think the other part of that is bringing people into the conversation, as you said. I think the worst thing is gossip in a business. Did you hear that so-and-so is happening? Did you know that this is happening? Well, I don't like this. You start to develop these opinions on something that you probably don't even know what it is yet. And because innovation is that constantly changing model, it's that beast of movement and change and thought and sort of trial, if you like. There's going to be a constant view on what's going on. Where are we at? How are we doing? Is it going well? Is it not? And the less you talk, the more you breed gossip, the more you breed opinions, the more you breed things that will potentially impact the success of your project negatively. So my view on bringing people in is just bring the appropriate people in at the appropriate time to contribute to innovation in whatever way you see fit. Whether that's external or not, it doesn't really matter, but I think it's just got to be that balance of communication so that we're constantly moving and talking, even if it's little and often.
Brilliant. Cris, you've always talked about how organisations not having the skills can be a result of organisations not having innovation on the strategic agenda. But I wondered if you could talk a bit about what you see as the key innovation skills that are lacking.
Yeah, so I think yes, the strategy is key, but I think the direction and the trajectory of that strategy is the important bit. So if I go back to the last question, a lot of organizations talk about wanting to be innovative and wanting to build that innovation capability. But in reality, what the senior team really want is quick results. They want to innovate. They don't want to be innovative. So they want new stuff. And the challenge with that is you articulate a certain direction and a trajectory to the organization, and you say, this is what we want. And you set off down that path, but actually what you actually want and what you're really hoping for is something different. So a classic case is, I worked with a big global bank about 3 years ago now that put an innovation team together, and the brief was to build innovation capability. And one of the ways we did that was we used real problems. You know, we didn't use hypothetical things to build capability. We started to solve genuine problems and capitalize on opportunities that team saw. Within about 6 months, we had a new product. And that new product was then a brilliant demonstration of capability building, right? Here's what we've done in a short space of time with these teams, with these new frameworks, with these new approaches. And the senior team said, that's absolutely brilliant. Go and give us more of that. So capability building suddenly stopped because now we had a new product. And the senior team said, no, actually, no, that's what we want, right? You've delivered something that's got value. We can sell that, right? That's a commercial asset we now have. Go and do more of that. And the team said, yeah, but that's not why we're here, right? We're here to build skills and scale capability. The reality is what the team actually wanted was results, not skills and capability. And one of the things we're really clear about in terms of a pre-qualification with clients is which one of those two things they want to do, because both are fine, but you have to be clear on which one it is. You can't 6-7 months into a program of work say, actually what we really wanted was the other thing.
Arend, you touched on a point which we're very passionate about, that innovation is different from having ideas. How do you tackle a situation with an organization where there's a clear lack of innovation management skills?
I think I'd like to just quickly pick up on something that Cris has said in connection with that question, which is, and I think his observation is absolutely right. There's really, I think in most organizations, we get rewarded for doing, not thinking. And so actually, the predominant operating method, if you want to be successful, is you deliver stuff. Yeah. And so I think, so this is kind of hardwired into the organization. So the majority of people, learn very quickly that there's, better reward in putting out fires than to actually put a lot of time into thinking why those fires exist in the first place. So I think that's the first thing. So, I think the question specifically really about innovation in organizations, I think is dependent on two things. One, I think clearly there is the need now to invest in those kind of thinking skills that we've that we were talking about, that I've just referenced. But I think that's not enough. I think it's also the absence of a systematic or systems approach to innovation in organizations. So what I think it's not enough just to have a group of people who will go off and own innovation, because let's be honest, we know that in any company that's conducted some sort of exercise on innovation has learned pretty quickly that the same few people are innovative. That the same few people come up with all the ideas, and so very, very quickly, even if it is a sustained effort in any organization, very, very quickly, the organization by definition will run out of new ideas. So what we need is to do a couple of things. One, we do need to teach more people, the kind of thinking skills, analytical thinking, complex problem solving, systems thinking, ideation strategy, those kinds of things. I think that's just generally good for your business. But I think you need to couple those together with a system, a process, such as Solverboard, for example. One of the powerful features of Solverboard is that it sets out a system. It requires a discipline. And if you don't have that system or that discipline in your organization, ideas themselves will probably not be realized, will never come to fruition. We all know that we have loads and loads of ideas, but actually, it's, as Cris pointed out, unless you can bring those ideas to fruition, you can't get value from them. So I think that's those are two important ideas. I think the third thing that I want to say is that because we'll quickly run out of ideas, and because we're going to rely on the same few people who are innovative in our organization, I think that's just human nature. I think organizations do need to start thinking about and getting comfortable with the idea of opening the box, if you like. So looking outside the industry, collaborating with other organizations, bringing in people from different age profiles, different generations, different parts of life, parts of the world. There's a huge opportunity to look at different types of industries, even industries that appear to have no connection with yours, and to learn from all of those people and all those different types of organizations.
Fantastic. There's some great stuff in there, and thanks, Aaron, for the plug. Sneaking that in there. The fourth blocker was no clear definition of innovation, and I'll come back to Cris to kick us off on this one.
Okay, this is a fundamental question, right? That I want to say I mean we, organizations, corporates, everyone still struggles with. And the challenge with most organizations I see don't have a really robust definition of innovation, right? At best, there will be different definitions of innovation across the organization. And we measure this, right? We run maturity models with clients. And one of the core questions in there is, does the organization have a clear definition of innovation? And it's very, very, very rare. And in fact, I can't remember the last time where in that assessment, a client answered across the board, yes, we have a clear organization-wide The majority of answers come back in around the answers around, no, we're unclear about what innovation is, or there are multiple definitions of innovation across the organization. Now, if we go back to strategy, common sense dictates we cannot build a strategy for an organization if we're not clear on the definition of the fundamental reason that we're creating that strategy. So, and one of the challenges I think is the definitions of innovation are very generic, very basic, and they're in most cases not that much further from the definition you get in the dictionary, right? Innovation is the introduction of new ideas with value or something like that. So in itself, that's all right. And if you don't have a definition in an organization, then, you know, that plugs a gap. What I think is really important is, and we go back to the word that I've mentioned a few times today, and Aaron just mentioned a minute ago, is the system. When we want to build a culture of innovation, innovation capability, etc., that is a demonstrable capability the organization has, to do that, we have to build an innovation system. And everything in that system has to have value. Anything that doesn't have value and doesn't interlink and play and connect to the other parts of the system is by default surplus to the system. So for me, a really weak definition of innovation just doesn't really help.
Excellent, Cris, thanks. Katherine, you talked about how it's useful to look at what innovation is not and defining what doesn't include, and also mentioned about how defining the difference between innovation, change management, and transformation, obviously with this conference. Talk a little bit about that. Tell us how you would approach that.
So I'm working on a big project at the moment with the government, and we're looking at, we've got some really key markers of where we want to be in the future with this particular department. It's going to radicalise and hopefully change what the whole area of this section of the government looks like. And so we are spending a whole year up front purely on innovation. And as part of that, to answer your question, with those relationships in each of those areas, we are educating the internal departments on what innovation is and what it is not. We are educating them on what transformation and what change is. Because I feel like quite often it's a hidden area. It's an area where those people over there do that stuff, and it's a happy accident when something goes well, but otherwise they're just, playing around. They're just giving it a go. And actually what we want to do is start educating. Quite often what we mistake is we're quite clear, if you think about going to university, if you're off to do medicine, we all know you're going to be a doctor when you come out at the end. If you're off to do humanities, we're not really sure. Because you could come out and you could be anything at the end of that. And I think that's the thing with work. We stop learning, we stop teaching our teams. You recruit someone, you let them go into a business, and then they perform that role, and off they go, head down, and they continue in that department. And if they sit in something clear, like HR or finance, then brilliant. But if they don't, then we're not giving anyone an opportunity to learn what they're doing. So this entire year of the program that I'm on is dedicated to innovation, what it means, what it looks like. And it is dedicated to trialing things, to saying to people, this is a year we're just going to give things a go. We're just going to see how it operates. We're going to see where it lands. We're going to trial it. But the big thing that I think we've all sort of touched on a little bit here, but innovation doesn't just happen inside a business. It happens outside of the business. You've got to listen to, what's going on in the general markets, what's going on out there in terms of trends, but also we speak to our customers regularly. In fact, they are the first group of people that we speak to. We might all have an idea internally, but if we think our idea is wonderful, but the people who are going to be on the end of it don't have any interest in it whatsoever, and their version of happy was something a lot less, something a lot bigger, something in a completely different area, and we've taken it so far down before checking with them, we will have made a big mistake. So we're spending that time investing up front and making sure that we're clarifying our parameters, making sure that we will know what success means to us, but also what success means to them. And we're talking about that, making it a fundamental part of the transformation and change process.
Absolutely, makes perfect sense. Arend, when it comes to defining innovation, rather than looking at what innovation is, you were looking at why. My first question is always, why do you want to innovate? How does that lead us to helping us define what innovation is?
Yeah, I think innovation, a little bit like leadership and strategy, is kind of falls into the category that everybody wants some, but nobody's quite sure about what it is. So these are kind of as sexy organization terms. Everybody wants to be the innovation director, the strategy director, or part of the leadership team. But when they get there, they're not quite sure what it actually implies, what it means to do. So that's quite interesting. I think I think what Cris, things that Cris and Katherine have talked about are really spot on. But I think really for me, innovation really comes back to that value idea again. We've got to understand that if innovation is done inconsistently or haphazardly, it's because it's not connected clearly to what the organization's strategy and goals are. So I think there's the idea that actually we might just become innovative, we might just get on and do some stuff that's new. We've all seen that problem in organizations. It's flavor of the month. It's usually costly. It doesn't go anywhere. So for me, when under those conditions, people lose the appetite for innovation very, very quickly.
Brilliant, thanks, Arend. So our fifth and final blocker we're looking at today is disagreement over who owns innovation. And I'll start with Katherine on this. Ownership. How do you tackle this blocker?
So ownership in innovation for me is all about the hot potato. Nobody wants it at the start because it's kind of like something that's a little bit risky, but once it's cooled down a bit, everybody's hungry. You kind of got that idea that disagreement is purely because it was something that seemed like something that was a bit risky, but once the risk element is gone, I'm quite happy to be involved. I think then we've all been in a situation where once we've started a project, we've talked about the practicalities of, responsibility, accountability, are we being informed or being consulted, and all those practical sort of change management terms. But it's really, really important actually to make sure you've got those measures in place. Quite often, and this goes back to that point I was saying about learning and having that definition between what change management is. Innovation and transformation are the systemic practices of moving through and making sure that we are delivering through iterative improvement cycles. Change management is the framework that underpins how we're going to do all of that. Solverboard, for example, is the platform that you can use to provide a framework, coupled with the responsibility of having change management practitioners in place who are going to put those markers in the sand. You need to know, it's like with children, you need discipline, you need boundaries, and with adults at work, you need discipline, you need boundaries, you need things that you're striving for so that people can be kept into clear responsibility and ownership, teams. And it's okay that you're not doing this section over here because you're doing this really important section over here. And that comes back to that point again about success. How will I know when I've been successful? Because a project or a program or portfolio of work has got its own success parameters that you're driving towards, that you may or may not hit. But individuals are the key part of that process. They're the ones who are going to rally you off the rails or not. And they have to understand what their role is. They have to understand when they're successful, when they're not, when they're going to feel certain things and when they won't. And they are your biggest modelling function for being able to take this forward or not. If they are not clear, you are going to have a real uphill battle to push to where you want to be. So in terms of disagreement, I like to see it less as a disagreement, but rather a lack of clarity. Have I stated at the beginning where we're all going to fit in this piece of the puzzle? Because if we just are driving on passion and we're driving on enthusiasm, well, that's brilliant. You want to keep that and you want to keep it sustained, but it's got to be localized and it's got to be focused for us to have a good chance of success.
So it's more confusion over who owns.
Yes, I think.
Who wants it. Arend, you kind of echoed that a little bit in the report where you talked about not necessarily the hot potato, but talked about the fact that a lot of people are busy firefighting. And maybe don't have time for innovation and don't have time to look beyond, a few months down the line and think forward. How do you suggest remedying that situation when there's either a disagreement or a disinterest in owning innovation?
I think it's really quite interesting. I think this might be an interesting challenge to all the people watching this cast, and that is how many of you actually have innovation anywhere? A responsibility for or contribution to the innovation of your business, actually anywhere in your job description. And the chances are that actually, other than if you're actually fundamentally, the innovation director or manager, the chances are is that it appears nowhere. Similarly, the problem actually, and I often ask this at conferences, which is how many of you have anywhere in your job description a line that suggests that you might be responsible for actually helping the business grow and make more money, or any version of those words. And again, my experience is that in fact I've never had anyone in any of the audiences I've ever addressed actually tell me that they've got those words or anything to that effect in their job description of any type. And so the problem with this is actually, again, back to this thing that I call functional thinking, that frequently we define our role, our contribution in terms of our job titles and job descriptions. So what we actually have done, we don't expect people to contribute to the innovation piece. It's not in their job description. We've not made it explicit to them. But the problem with that then is, of course, is that it turns to the people who are the innovation directors or managers, and they do start thinking that that's their job and no one else's job. And of course, for me, everyone should own innovation. Like everybody should own sales. Like everybody should own, making this company more successful. Those are all parts of, we should all. That's really our second job. Our functional contribution is just half of what it is we do. The other half is actually making this a great company. And innovation and growing and making more money is all part of that story.
Absolutely. And I think, Cris, you agreed with that and talked about how it's the leaders that need to own the innovation agenda. But you talked a little bit about culture as well, and how that needs to filter down, not from a necessarily hierarchical point of view and responsibility in terms of ownership, but just the emotion and the feeling behind that.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view on whether everyone needs to own innovation. I think if you take a typical organization, let's take a bank, and you've got a young guy or girl who's just works behind the counter in a bank, when you go in and you pay a check in or whatever, asking them to own innovation is very, very difficult to try and implement. And I think how I look at it, and if you look at this as a system and a systematic approach, in the same way that exploration and exploitation take different skills and need a different approach. We have to take a contextual and a relevant approach to how we all innovate in an organization. And the way we do that is we talk about, for me, leaders should own the innovation agenda, right? Absolutely. The top of the organization, if you are in that leadership layer, and let's not get into the complexities of different organizational structures, but for the purpose of this conversation, let's take that typical triangular structure of leaders, managers, and the rest of the employees. Leaders should absolutely own the innovation agenda. Every single one of them spearheaded by the CEO. And what we then talk about is, but there are other leaders who aren't leaders, right? So who are the leaders without a title? And are they key influencers? Are they, different people in the organization who are that passionate? How do we enable them to own innovation as well? Because that's not for everyone, and it takes a certain mindset and a certain passion and a commitment and an energy. So we then talk about the middle of the organization. How do we enable them to what we call drive innovation? So we call this the ODC framework. So how do they drive innovation on a daily basis? And typically we're talking about middle managers, team leaders, key influencers. How do they drive innovation on a daily basis? How do they bring it alive? How do they make it real? Those people are typically in the middle of the organization, the ones closest to the rest of the employees by default, and the ones most responsible actually for what they do on a daily basis and enabling them to take time out or work on projects or whatever. And they're also the group of people most responsible for going back to the risk and failure, etc. They're also the group most responsible for hitting targets, right? So how do leaders who own the innovation agenda build a culture and build an environment and an ecosystem that empowers and enables those managers and team leaders to drive innovation and bring it alive on a daily basis? And then for everyone else in the organization, we talk about how do we then enable anyone in the organization to contribute to innovation? And that contribution can be in big ways and it can be in small ways. And the challenge is then, how do we measure that? So to Arend's point, one of the things we do a lot of is redesigning leadership frameworks so that they do include innovation. They do include, how we evidence whether leaders have owned that innovation agenda. We do include stuff around mindset and behavior and actual action to demonstrate that they are owning the innovation agenda. And then when we get into this kind of framework, you then start to look at, okay, so for all three of those layers, if we keep it simple, what are the physical attributes that need to be in place? So Solverboard, for example, would be a physical attribute. That's a tool that the organization needs. Budget, the strategy needs to be in place, right? Time and space, you might need a venture board. There might, all of those things, the tools and frameworks, design thinking, whatever it is, those are all the tools and assets that the business needs. But each one of those layers might need different tools and different assets, depending on whether they're owning, driving, or contributing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cris. And thank you, Arend. Thank you, Katherine. That concludes our session today. Some really interesting points, some great practical advice there. To those of you watching this today, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. Solverboard.com will be where you can find the report. You can find innovation insights, other interviews and podcasts like this. And all that remains for me is to say thank you very much indeed to everybody involved.